Howdy everyone, and today I'm testing out a lens that I've had a lot of requests to do over the past 3 years, the Sigma 150-600mm f5-6.3 DG OS HSM C, or Contemporary. I hope you're settled down because there's quite a lot to look into with this particular lens. Don't mix this less expensive Contemporary or C version of the lens with its more expensive brother, the Sport or S version. The Sports version is almost a kilogram heavier and enjoys excellent, tough build quality, but they have the same focal range and maximum aperture, and the consensus from most reviews I've seen is that the optical quality of the two lenses are broadly comparable. Some say the Sports version is a little sharper, some say they're the same, and one or two even prefer the Contemporary version's optics. Both are designed for full-frame or APS-C digital SLR cameras, but are also adaptable onto mirrorless cameras. Now, the reason I bought this lens was for my own pleasure, and not just for testing, as my wife and I started feeding the many different birds in our garden, and you'll be seeing a lot of them in this video. I managed to get it for only £570 like new over on eBay, together with a Sigma USB dock, an absolute bargain. Normally, this lens costs £800 in the UK and about $900 in the US, or about €900. Its impressive zoom range of 150-600mm is telephoto all the way, giving you absolutely massive reach when you zoom all the way in, making it a perfect lens for wildlife photography, or spying on people. Don't spy on people. There are other obvious uses for this extremely long telephoto zoom range, so landscape photography or astrophotography, and even portrait pictures. At 600mm, you'll have to shout at your subject quite loudly though, but the compressed backgrounds will make your pictures more simple. Bear in mind that if you use this lens with an APS-C sensor camera, the focal range will be the equivalent of about 225-900mm on a full-frame camera. Amazing! The equivalent depth of field will naturally be deeper too. A high-resolution APS-C camera is likely to strain this lens's image quality to the limit though. We'll see how it holds up in a minute. In order to keep the size, weight and price of this lens down, its maximum aperture is limited to f5 at wide angle end and f6.3 as you zoom in. So it's a really poor lens for shooting indoors or in dark situations, and it won't give you the most out of focus backgrounds, although at 600mm some decent background separation is entirely possible. f6.3 is also letting in just about enough light for your camera's autofocus system to work properly as well, and it worked fine on my Canon 6D, more on that in a minute. First though, let's look at the build quality. On this Contemporary version of the lens, the rear section and the tripod mount are made of metal, but the front section plastic. All in all, it weighs about 2 kilos, manageable, but your arms will get tired if you're carrying it around for more than a couple of hours. The lens mount is made of metal, unsurprisingly, and it's edged with a weather sealing gasket. The focus ring is rubberized. It's not particularly smooth to turn, and it can be very slightly sticky, but actually it's quite precise enough for easy manual focusing. You can turn it at any time in manual or autofocus mode, and it does not have hard stops. The zoom ring at the front is large and rubberized, but it too is not the smoothest to turn and has a very slight stickiness to it. It works fine though, really. This is the first time I've handled a lens where you can lock it in place in several different positions, a neat feature, although it only locks very securely at 150mm. The end of the lens is rubberized to make it easier for people who want to zoom in or out by pushing or pulling the end. Not my preferred way of zooming, but it's an option for you. The very edge of the lens is also rubberized, presumably to stop the whole thing cracking open if you accidentally hit it against something. Now let's look at the lens's electronics. Firstly, I should say that it's quite customizable if you plug it into Sigma's USB dock, which actually I recommend doing. It's sold separately for £40 or about $50 US, or you could always just hire one from the many lens hire companies that are around. You can update the lens's firmware if needed using that USB dock, and my one did the first time I plugged it in. You can micro-adjust the autofocus system too, if you need. Thankfully, it wasn't necessary on my copy of the lens, and a lot of cameras already have this feature nowadays. You can also set the lens's customized modes, of which there are 2, which you can switch to on the side of the lens. With each mode, you can adjust the speed of the autofocus. I found that made very little difference, but I set it to slow in the hope of getting better accuracy. You can also adjust the image stabilization or OS system, and this made a big difference. In normal mode, the image stabilization is a bit poor. Here's some footage without stabilization, and here it is turned on to the default setting, and there's not a huge difference. However, if you set one of your custom buttons to dynamic or moderate view mode, then it'll perform far better, as you can see here. I found moderate view mode was the most effective for me. Both in stills and video mode, it offered quite effective stabilization, even at 600mm. So, for best results personally, I set customization mode 1 to smooth autofocus and moderate view mode, stabilization, and I just leave the lens in that mode now, along with OS mode 1, which means it corrects both the vertical and horizontal axes. That worked nicely for me. Let's look a little more at the autofocus system. It's nice and quiet, and at 150mm, nice and quick. Zoom into 600mm, as I'm doing just here, and the autofocus will slow down, but that's to maintain accuracy. When shooting through my Canon camera's viewfinder, it was only reasonably accurate, missing about 10% of the time or so. But when shooting in live view mode, the accuracy was great. Now, I also adapted this onto my Sony a7R II using Sigma's very good MC11 adapter. As you can see in this video footage, it was able to focus, but a bit slowly, and sometimes there was some huge focus hunting when shooting both stills and video. I think the f6.3 maximum aperture was a bit hostile to the a7R II's slightly older autofocus system. It got the job done, but I ended up using the lens with my Canon 6D most of the time, as the autofocus was just miles faster. Here are a few more details. The lens appears to me to be parfocal, useful for video makers. Also, here's some footage taken at 600mm and f22 with me focusing in and out. As you can see, for most of the focal range, there isn't much focus breathing, but when you start focusing very closely, the image zooms out a bit, so at close focus distances, it won't be quite 600mm. The lens's filter thread size is large 95mm, and it comes with a nice padded case and deep lens hood, which fixes on securely. Overall, while it doesn't handle as nicely as a more professional grade lens, the build quality is fairly solid, and the autofocus and image stabilization work satisfactorily. Shooting this lens handheld at 600mm is not exactly easy, but neither is it too hard to get good results. Alright then, image quality. Firstly, let's test it on a lower resolution full frame camera, my trusty old 20MP Canon 6D. There are no image corrections here. At 150mm and the aperture wide open at f5, the lens is nice and sharp in the middle with OK contrast. The corners are a touch softer, but not bad. They look much nicer at f8 or f11 and even f16 though. Zoom in a bit to 300mm and the maximum aperture of f5.6, the lens is really sharp in the middle of the image and also great over in the corners. Stop down the aperture if you like for a bit more brightness in the corners, but no more sharpness. Zoom in more to 450mm and at the new maximum aperture of f6.3, the lens is reasonably sharp in the middle of the image and the corners are slightly soft. Stop down to f8 though, or f11 for a punchier image. Finally, zoom all the way into 600mm and at f6.3, the lens is still reasonably sharp in the middle, although contrast is a bit low now. The corners are putting up a good fight. Stop down to f8 for noticeably more sharpness and contrast from the corners and back to the middle of the image, although there's no improvement at f11 or darker. Overall, on a 20 megapixel camera, it's a good performance. There's always quite nice resolution to your images, especially if you stop down to f8, and the wider angles are impressively sharp too. Alright, let's challenge the lens with a much higher resolution full frame camera, my 42 megapixel Sony a7R II, which should give us a far clearer picture of what's really happening. At 150mm and f5, the middle of the image is impressively sharp. Contrast is just good though. The corners are also really very decent, if a bit dark. Stop down to f8 for more brightness in the corners, and a touch more resolution and contrast across the whole image range, and f11 is very nice too. Zoom in to 300mm, and at f5.6, in the middle of the image, we see exceptional sharpness. The corners are noticeably softer, but still very good. f8 shows a bit more brightness and contrast, and f11 and f16 give you a tiny bit more resolution. Let's zoom into 450mm. Again, at the widest aperture, image quality remains really sharp in the middle, and the corners again, also very good. f8 is about the same, but stop down to f11 for slightly more resolution. And finally, we reach 600mm. At the widest aperture, the image is a little softer in the middle now, finally, with weak contrast, although it's not really bad image quality. Interestingly, the corners continue to be pretty good. At f8 or f11 though, there's plenty of contrast and resolution in the corners and back in the middle too, as you can see here. Well, on the Sony a7R II, I was very pleasantly surprised. From other reviews I've seen on the internet, I wasn't expecting a performance as sharp as this, especially at 600mm. Maybe I just have a copy of the lens with perfect optical alignment or something. I'm not complaining though, as it did a good job on my 42 megapixel camera. Bear in mind though, it's easy to get very sharp results like this when you're carefully and methodically shooting test shots, using a heavy-duty tripod and focusing manually. If you shoot handheld with this lens at 600mm, it's a bit more of a challenge to get pictures that are this sharp. Well, finally, how does the lens perform on a modern APS-C camera? I'm testing it here, adapted onto my 24 megapixel Canon EOS M3. This will be the hardest test for image quality in the middle of the lens's projected image. Firstly, at 150mm and f5, the lens is pretty sharp in the middle, and the corners are quite good too, though a little chromatic aberration is visible now. The corners are a touch sharper at f8, but on APS-C, if you stop down to f11, they start to get softer again from the effect of diffraction. This is the same throughout the entire zoom range, by the way. You get best results at f8 on APS-C. At 300mm and f5.6, the lens is still really sharp in the middle of the image and really sharp over in the corners. f8 is about the same. Very impressive image quality here. At 450mm and f6.3, the lens is a bit softer in the middle of the image now, with lower contrast, but there's still some workable resolution there. The corners, admirably, don't see any deterioration. f8 is just a little sharper, both in the corners and back in the middle. Finally, 600mm. At f6.3, the lens is rather soft in the middle, but admittedly not completely dreadful. The corners are about the same. However, stop down to f8 for a small improvement in the corners, but a considerable improvement back in the middle. There's workable resolution here now. Overall, over on APS-C, while it's never a very sharp lens, you can actually get some pretty usable resolution for an optic of this focal length, especially if stopped down to f8. I haven't tested many very long telephoto lenses on APS-C, which can do as well as the Sigma 150-600mm. It's not too bad. Well now, let's see about distortion and vignetting on a full frame camera. The lens performs very evenly across the zoom range here, starting from 150mm, and even if you zoom in to 600mm, you will always see some moderate pincushion distortion and vignetting in the corners when the aperture is wide open. Stop down to f8 or f11 to tame that vignetting down and get brighter corners. It's the kind of performance you might expect here, really. This lens can focus as closely as about 2.7 meters, Not especially close, but you can get images of smaller subjects here if you're happy to do so at 600mm. At f6.3, the close-up image has pretty ghostly looking contrast. f8 is far sharper looking though, and at f11 there's a further improvement. Long telephoto lenses come with deep lens hoods because they do not like bright lights. The good news is that there isn't a problem when bright lights are out of the picture with a Sigma lens, but when they do make their way in, you'll see loads of flaring and a loss of contrast, so use the lens hood. Finally, bokeh. This lens's out of focus backgrounds always look lovely and smooth in my opinion, certainly no problems here. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed your lecture today. This video certainly took a very long time to put together. Overall, I'm really happy with the Sigma 150-600mm C. It's capable of getting reasonably sharp pictures at an extreme focal length of 600mm, although bear in mind, as I said earlier, that even with its good image stabilization, it'll be harder to get the sharpest pictures when shooting handheld. You will get best results with a tripod and careful focusing. Now, Tamron have also released two similar lenses to this one. Their original one I tested about 3 years ago. Honestly, the older Tamron lens and this Sigma one are very, very comparable. They're both quite dependable and reasonably sharp. My impression is that the Sigma lens is just a touch sharper, and I slightly prefer its build quality too. But bear in mind, Tamron have now released a new G2 version of this lens with improved optics, which I hope to test out one day soon. But ultimately, the Sigma lens here really is very capable, quite portable for a lens of this type, and good value for money. It could open up an enjoyable world of wildlife photography to you. It's not the kind of lens you'll be using every day, but it gets nice results when you do, especially with a little practice, so it comes recommended.